Well, hi there, my friends. I hope it's been a great week for you. It's been a great week and a long week for me, as I'm sure it has for you. As I read through your um, many discussion boards, um, mostly last weekend and this, I've had a lot to think about. Um, one of the many things that I've thought about is how much, when we all get down to it, how much we all, in some ways, connect and how much we have in common. What hard workers you are. It's just wonderful to be able to read and to share and connect with some of that. I've often wondered in a textbook for organizational communications, such as ours, why we don't get into chapters such as 9 and 10 at the very least earlier instead of later as the term is winding down. It seems to me it might be more helpful because I actually think organizations are more driven by some of the things we learn later than probably some of the things that we learn primarily. I know that we've talked a lot about structure and we talk a lot about theories. We talk a lot about hierarchy and how we can see different organizations work along those lines. But I really think when we get down to it, when we get right down to it, if we can put our finger on the heartbeat of what makes organizations work or how they operate, effective or ineffective, both internally and externally, then we can put our finger, if we put our finger on that, what we're doing is putting our finger onto the heartbeat of who makes up those organizations. And that's why people, that's why human resources, that's why personnel, that's why heads and leaders of organizations are key. We may not say that, we may not think that. People might get along with saying, as long as you have this skill set, or as long as you meet this definition of what's required, then you should get that job. And we live in a culture that is very quick to point the finger or sue and say, if I don't get this job and I'm qualified otherwise, then I don't understand. But the more I've been around, the more I began to understand that it's not just necessarily even about an individual, but about those people that an individual works for. Early on in my experience, I actually took a job just before I started teaching high school for a company called Bartlett and Company. They were located in the Board of Trade in Kansas City, Missouri. And I was shocked to discover I had to take a 542 word test. And it was not about my skills or my abilities, had nothing to do with my degree. It had nothing to do with my experience, my status as a veteran, nothing to do with my gender. But the question, it was a 554 word question basically on personality, on how I could be expected to get along with others in the workplace, on my ethics, my integrity. And I thought at the time that it was pretty bizarre. It asked questions like, have you ever thought about killing your mother? I thought it was a little intrusive. And in fact, I had heard, and it was substantiated because I later worked for Human Resources, that a couple of people had filed EEO complaints. Um, but, it was one of the most pleasant workplaces I have ever been in. And they prided themselves on that their pay and their benefits were not outstanding, but they had a workforce that was incredible. And that was back in the 90s. So I'm dating myself just a bit. But just to ramble a little bit about that, that some of you are on the younger end and some of you have some maturity and understand a little bit more about what I'm saying. So I'm very excited as we move along here in the next few weeks to see what you're going to come up with in your projects, because honestly, don't psych yourself out. Don't be, very concerned. I think that this is where you begin to percolate all of these ideas that we've been talking about and can, really put them together in a unique and creative way in a case study that takes an organization and looks at it both internally and externally and applies that which you have learned, um, a theory, a commonality, and really begins to explain and use some examples from it and put together just a really good, strong paper that's backed by support, and then also produce a project that has your original voice on it, such as a YouTube video. And something that's a bit creative. I'm looking for that spark of originality or creativity that I know that you can produce. For this YouTube video, for instance, I'm simply doing this on my Mac. I switched over to my new laptop that I bought in Portland when my old one went on the fritz, and using iMovie. I'm just going to import this straight off of my iMac or my Mac laptop, not my iMac, and then I will take it and convert it to a more usable mobile size, and then I'll upload it to YouTube. It'll be that easy. It's not really a difficult process. My biggest challenge will be to get it onto my other computer, or actually I can load it straight up from this one, but typically I'll take it to another drive and upload it from my Mac Pro because it's a little bit faster. But no consequence. That's just a chore. And actually, since I'm not doing it from my hotel room, which is where I tried to do it previously, I have a better connection here. And as long as you have a pretty fast connection, you can go straight to YouTube and upload it. Okay, a couple of things I did want to hit on. Again, thank you so much for those personal reflections in your discussion on what your background has taught you regarding race, discrimination, ethnicity, your ethnicity, and so forth. As you discussed and looked at chapter 9 and 10, and how those organizations involved you, and gender. One thing I was looking at in chapter 9 this week in particular, there's been such things in the news recently that really affect all of what's going on organizationally and news-wise, that affect those of you who are public relations majors, those of you who might be journalism majors, and even those of you who are not. It's very important to note some things that are taking place, even in our nation right now, that happen within organizations, and then things that happen that affect organizations. This chapter 9, Communicating Gender at Work, I was looking at something on page 206 in particular, but the whole chapter itself, is rife with talk about feminist perspectives and liberal feminism, creating that level playing field. But I took a look at page 206, and it talks heavily about the, that feminism is not that single unified collective movement, and then just what it is. And in that context of talking about feminism, it inevitably brings up the idea of discrimination and what is discrimination. And within that brings up the idea of religious discrimination. Well, a couple of weeks ago, I started working on a story. There's a big story out there out of Florida, but there's also a big story out of Indiana that many of you may have heard about, which has actually been a big story that kind of started out of a New England state. I'm not even sure I remember which New England state a couple of years ago, More recently, there's been a big story out of Oregon. All of these big stories that I'm talking about relate to what people are referring to as religious freedom or religious discrimination. In the case in Oregon, there was a baker who decided that this couple, and she primarily was the baker, he operated the bakery, that she did not want to materially bake a cake and participate in a same sex wedding. Um, I find it interesting as I hear about the florists and the bakers that are asked to do these things, because I've been working very intimately with a florist and a baker, designing the cake and the flowers, and working with a wedding planner even. That's another situation that's come up. For my daughter's wedding, she'll be married in 2 weeks. And so, beyond just walking into a store and putting something in a grocery cart, these are people that are using um, their creative gifts and their creative abilities. I know that because I'm also a photojournalist as well as a teacher. I'm also a newspaper editor and a writer. And so whenever I engage in these sort of activities, I'm actually using my creative powers. I'm thinking, I'm putting my heart into it per se. And people like that. A person that's being passionate and creative about their work, and they're working long hours, they're sleeping, they're dreaming, they're thinking about what are they going to do to enhance this activity, this event. And I'm hoping that the gal that poured her heart into my daughter's wedding cake was thinking about the springtime in Paris theme. And she talked to us about, the personalities of her and her fiance, and a little bit about the family. And, we shared all that when we sat down with her. And so all of that is part of the creative process. In any event, what's happened is that those who don't believe convictionally in same-sex marriage have kind of stood up for their conviction and said, we don't materially want to participate. Could you please go down the street? Or, here's a list of bakeries. Now, some people would say, and they have a right to say, well, we don't think that that's right. That's discrimination. And so what you have is the idea that some people feel like they're accommodating in that way, and some people feel like they're actually that's a form of discrimination. You shouldn't be able to do that. And on the contrary, those people that have the convictions feel like they're being discriminated against by having to participate materially in an event or a circumstance that they don't feel like they can, such as a lot of different scenarios. So anyway, these things are coming really to a head, and the way that our media is portraying them, for the most part, is very one-sided. I think most people can recognize that. You have a choice when you create a headline. You have a choice when you write a story and who you interview first, or who you, the way you present it, the way you write that first opening paragraph, the weight that you give to your words. It's hugely important. And so these things are being played out in the media. And in Indiana, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, based off of a federal law that President Clinton actually prepared and signed into law years ago, was just seen as a law that could ban gays and lesbians from taxis and from hotels and from all sorts of things, and which was a total misconstruing the case. And so these things are really interesting in this day and age, and in this explanation of feminism and radical and liberal feminism and so forth. Very important to remember just what the definitions are, and how much and at what expense some workplaces will go to promote these ideas, and just at what point you might feel like whether it's your viewpoint that is being discriminated against, and whether the pendulum has kind of swung in an interesting perspective. I say Florida as a case. I mentioned earlier Florida as a case. In Florida, what's come up is because some wording that prohibited same-sex couples from adopting children has now been taken, is been considered to be taken out by the Senate, what's happened is that adoption agencies, which over 50% of the children are cared for by private foster care and adoption agencies in Florida, 50% of the children who are cared for adoptions and for foster care are cared for by private and religious adoption agencies and foster care agencies. One of those, and the reason I'm familiar is one of those is the Florida Baptist Children's Home. And when I was in Florida, I did extensive work with them. They are in danger of having to close down if they have to adopt children out to or foster children out to same-sex married couples. The reason for that is Florida Baptists simply don't, within their convictional stance, allow for that. They would allow for children to be adopted out to and to go into foster care with a mom and a dad, with a heterosexual couple. It's part of their convictional stance. So this puts, and same with Catholic Charities in Florida, so this puts them into a very compromised situation. So what's happened in Florida is they have this Conscience Protection Act, a bill that more conservative members of the legislature have been trying to enact. Well, this all happened in the middle of the firestorm of Indiana. And so the headlines immediately return to anti-gay bigots are now trying to prohibit same-sex couples from adopting or fostering children in Florida. Well, that's simply not true. They can go to a number of, I think, 77 different agencies in Florida to adopt children. They have been able to for the last 5 years. There's not one couple that hasn't been able to adopt children that is otherwise able to, or foster children. There are plenty of children to go around in Florida that need foster care and that need to be adopted. And so it's simply not true. But it's expedient for Christian agencies who've been in this business for over 100 years of taking care of children to be called bigots now. And so it's a deep, deep situation, and it's an organizational problem in the sense that this deeply affects the people that are working in those organizations on the inside and out, to be slammed and called bigots, to be thinking of, will they need to close down by July 1st because they won't be able to, in good conscience, withstand a lawsuit if they're sued now, because the first time somebody tries to adopt and then they're told they can't, they will be brought up on a lawsuit of discrimination, and they don't want to be in the courts. And the organizations that own them, the Catholic Church, the Florida Baptist Convention, and so forth, don't want to be open to that kind of liability. So these are huge organizational problems for people. So discrimination is a big issue within organizations, both personally and corporately. And as we move into this this age and this century, I'm thinking that these personal, not personal, but these cases of worldview, points of view, and viewpoint discrimination is going to become even bigger than our textbook might touch on and might explain. And for many who are Christians, then it might become an issue that is very explosive and very divisive as we move into that. So whether you see headlines that say, the Muslim Student Association has called for banning the film American Sniper on the University of Michigan campus. And then 2 days later, that's reversed. Well, there are struggles going on everywhere over whose viewpoint is actually going to prevail, even religiously, which religion it's going to be, as people begin to, not even begin to, but assert their rights, and then the courts have to try to discern whose rights are going to be accommodated. and it's very interesting times for all of us. Okay, so I've already gone on for about 20 minutes, and I didn't want to belabor you with a whole lot of stuff tonight. I think it's interesting. Starbucks kind of hit on the racism issues all over the place right now. We've got all you have to do is turn on the news, and I really caution you when you do turn on the news. Just realize with every headline, there's going to be two sides to every story. Especially if you're watching cable news, be especially careful to consider that news is being more and more tailored to be advocacy for one or another side. You're either going to be coming down, if you're particularly sympathetic to one side of the news, just think there's probably an entire other side of the news. So there's probably a balancing act you're going to need to be doing yourself. I'm not saying that it's not even truthful on one side or the other, but just remember that truth might be relative to the situation, and that's a harsh thing to say. But just today, some of you may not be familiar with the fact that Google has changed its algorithms. And this leads into something that you will talk about in chapter 11. Chapter 11 is going to talk a lot about, no, where did I think of that? Chapter 11 will talk a lot about leadership and so forth, and that's very significant. But in that, guys, you were to look at this week a short video of Steve Jobs at the former CEO who's passed away since, of Apple. And one of the things he talks about is he's talking about organizational life and how people at Apple work more like a startup. But it got me to thinking just today. I was reading a story about Google and the new algorithms, and the fact that if you haven't read about this, it said that organizations that are not considered factual, or stories that are not considered fact-based, will no longer be in the same priority status or rise to the top of Google as ones that are considered more factual, such as in the area of green earth, you can tell I went a little bit dark here, and what happened, I went, oh, what's happening? My monitors went off in the background. There we go. On my large computers, and they were giving me some light on my face. I'm sorry, the warming trend of the earth. And so basically what Google has done is they're going to buy keywords in headlines and in a story. They're going to use their own formula for deciding what is a factual story and what is not. So if you believe in the Earth's warming trend as factual, or if you believe that this is not something that's scientific in its basis, and that the Earth is on kind of it's cyclic, and things go in cycles, and there's not really a big alarmist. You shouldn't be that alarmed out there by the warming trends in the Earth. And I'm a little embarrassed because I can't think of the earthworm. I can't even think of the word right now. Anyway, but in other words, they are going to take it upon themselves artificially to have artificial intelligence that will decide which stories are more factual. Is the resurrection a factual story, the one that's produced by Time Magazine, or the one produced by Christian Examiner? So the Christian Examiner story it may have come out first. And normally there's a whole slew of ways that something will rise to the top. But Time magazine may be considered more factual. It may be considered more legitimate of a story just because it has Time magazine may be considered more factual than a news service such as Christian Examiner. And so, according to the new algorithms, our story may be 1,002, even though it comes out 3 days before the Time magazine story on the same exact issue, using the same exact keywords and the same tags, meta tags. So it's going to be very interesting. I was reading a story in Western journalism today that said that it's going to be very interesting and very possibly discriminatory towards some, the way that these new Google analytics and Google features are applied. So we need to be watching that. Okay, so as far as chapter 11 is concerned, the other thing that I wanted to point out to you, this was really interesting. I mean, I wanted to talk a lot about your reflections that you turned in on growing up and race and all that. And, I mean, I just had a great time reading those. They were wonderful. Again, I can't say enough about them. I so appreciate you sharing of yourselves. I read those, just had a big cup of coffee, a couple mornings in a row, and just really enjoyed reading those, and went back to some of the kind of things of my childhood. And I know on a lot of yours, I gave you a lot of feedback. You brought back a lot of memories. Good stuff, good stuff. But okay, one of you said, I was reading through one of your case studies, and or maybe it was a reflection. You were talking about the leadership traits for this week, and you made quite a comment on disagreeing with height and intelligence as being part of this idea of an inborn leadership trait. And I just kind of chuckled and I thought, yeah, that's really interesting because I'm really tall, 5'11", and all of my life, I'm not so sure that height has been associated with leadership as much as height for me has been associated with hard work. I walk into my grandmother's house, she hands me a clean cloth and says, please clean the top of the refrigerator. I thought about that. And then I thought, well, and I'm not so sure. I'm not sure if it's leadership or working class. I can be standing there in a store, I think looking rather indecisive because I'm not sure where to find something, and somebody walks up to me and says, ma'am, could you help me find such and such? And I'm looking for something myself, but I'm supposed to help them find pillows, or a shirt, or a pacifier for the baby. And so I don't know whether the only thing I can come up with is my height. And then I had to really chuckle because I thought, you know what? President Obama's wife, Michelle Obama, had the same complaint a couple of years ago. Apparently, she was in Target. We know she shops at Target. And she said, and actually hers came out more of a complaint. She said that someone had asked her, oh my goodness, if she could please help them get something down from a shelf. And I think her remark was a little bit different than mine, because certainly I was not offended that they thought that I was just a helper. But, it was based on my height. Obviously, it wasn't based on my color. For those of you who didn't read through some of my discussions, I'm actually Cuban. My mother was Cuban. And I don't know what that's supposed to look like. Like some of you, my father's actually Anglo. And I grew up in a non-Spanish speaking household because my mother would actually speak Spanish with my aunts and my grandmother every once in a while. So tú hablas español? Ah, un poquito or un poco. Si habla español. And that and some numbers, some songs. Muévete mi niño y no llores más. You know, I can get along a little bit. I can understand almost everything. So no one speaks Spanish around me. Yo comprendo mucho, but I can hardly, have a conversation. It doesn't happen. One of these days I would really wish to learn. But all that to say is those shared experiences um, really help us to understand each other. And I think help in an organization. Um, I loved the video a couple weeks ago of the guy. I mean, just walking through that workplace, that was remarkable. So I think we're on good footing to make progress with that. Um, Back to the leadership, the crazy dancing guy, that was exceptional. But what's interesting for me, even culture wise, for those of you who live, and most of you do in Southern California, that's not so exceptional. See, if I were to take that from my experience now, having lived really all over the country, pretty much, if I were to take that same video down to like Missouri, for instance, and show that to the kids, like in a Missouri school where I was, that would be even more of a teaching tool, even more, because that's like way, way out of their context. California, I don't think that's so far out of your context. I think we probably, we probably chuckle. It's, that's not so far out of the realm. But for people in other places, that would be a little bit further out of the realm of what they're used to. And the more northeast you get, probably further from their realm of thinking. So down in the Southwest, we're pretty relaxed about things like that, and in California especially, I don't think we blink, and that's a good thing. But just remember that all of these things will help you and be put to good use. The final thing I want to say is your textbook is interesting. Our textbook is interesting. A lot of things in education, and of course, by this point, is a textbook's written from a person's point of view, reviewed many times by a committee, and published by a publisher. Some are very stringent, Random House and publishers like that, and they have kind of a policy, an editorial policy, and some, are produced with the idea that this person's a professional and we're going to make some money. So, take your textbook with a grain of salt. Go with what you know as far as ethics. Ethics are extremely important. Your worldview is extremely important, and balance that with what you read and what you know. That's extremely important. The Word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, and definitely more valid than any textbook. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. Have a good week. Email me if you have any questions. Text me if I don't respond immediately or quickly enough to your email. In these next 2 weeks, as we wind down to the end of the term and to my daughter's wedding, it's going to get a little crazy. I'll actually be in San Francisco next Thursday night. So I'll be in your state. I'll be there in California, my home state. It'll be so great. I left my heart. But I'll be in San Francisco for an awards ceremony on Friday night. And I'll tell you more about that later. But good night. Take care.